HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Exorcist Legacy, 50 Years of Fear, by Nat Segaloff. Read by Joe Hempel. Forward. The Exorcist and Me, by John A. Russo. In 1990, The Exorcist was inducted into the Horror Hall of Fame, and I was there as a featured guest, because Night of the Living Dead was being honored too, along with Psycho and Alien, 4 of the most iconic horror films of all time. Jason Miller was there to accept the award for The Exorcist, and Russ Streiner and I were there to accept the award for Night of the Living Dead. George A. Romero couldn't be there because he was directing The Dark Half. The host of the show was Robert Englund, and some of the presenters were Anthony Perkins, Kane Hodder, Roger Corman, John Landis, and Roddy McDowell. It was a black-tie affair, and as they say in Hollywood, everybody who was anybody was there, and there were throngs of people behind the velvet ropes wishing they could get in. One of them was my friend, Toby Hooper, and I was able to get him a pass. This was a lavish, star-studded event, definitely one of the high points of my career, and I almost didn't go. Russ Streiner and I had received our invitations while we were on location co-producing Night of the Living Dead 1990, but we had never heard of the Horror Hall of Fame, so I suggested that if Columbia Pictures could be talked into paying for our flights, then it might be worth going. They agreed, and we went, and I've been extremely happy with that outcome ever since. Of course, I had read William Peter Blatty's terrifying novel when it was first published, and I had also seen the movie that was splendidly directed by William Friedkin. Therefore, I was glad to meet Jason Miller in person at the Beverly Hills Hotel, where all the Horror Hall of Fame honorees were lodged in classy rooms and chauffeured to and fro in long black limousines. I was impressed that Jason had been nominated for an Academy Award as Best Supporting Actor for his role as Father Karras, and both of us had grown up in small Pennsylvania towns, he in Scranton and I in Clairton. So I felt that we had that connection, as well as being the same age and both fighting our way through the very tough and demanding entertainment business. I have to confess that, as an agnostic, I was not as badly frightened as millions of other folks were by The Exorcist, either as a novel or a movie, even though both versions were masterful depictions of demonic possession and its terrifying psychological manifestations. I'm not sure that the human body can be invaded by malevolent spirits, but I can suspend disbelief enough to temporarily be immersed in the horrors of what I am reading or watching. However, beyond Night of the Living Dead and Return of the Living Dead, I've written a vampire novel, The Awakening, from which I made my movie Heartstopper, and I've also written a screenplay, Intensive Scare, featuring a woman possessed by the soul of a serial killer. Therefore, I can have fun exploring supernatural themes and using them to entertain readers and moviegoers. Knowing that my friend and colleague Russ Streiner was profoundly affected by his first exposure to The Exorcist, so much so that he often says that it scared him more than any other movie, I asked him to explain why for the benefit of this foreword, and his explanation follows. When I first saw William Friedkin's film The Exorcist, I was a relatively new parent of a very young daughter. By an odd coincidence, I was watching the film during a weekday afternoon in an almost empty movie theater. That environment provided no comfort. As the early signs of possession began to take hold of the young girl, Reagan, my own imagination began to grip my thoughts, and the horror set in. As a parent, I imagined what I would do if my own daughter started showing some of the same behaviors that were showing up in the film character. How helpless would I feel? What would I do to protect my young daughter from an ailment that we couldn't see and when, at first, my daughter was helpless to describe what was taking control of her? To this day, I cannot watch The Exorcist without flashing back to that very first time I sat, alone, watching that film and thinking of my own daughter, who is now 50. I think Russ's reactions are probably quite typical of the millions of people who have been thrilled, excited, and frightened in a soul-searching way by Blatty's novel and Friedkin's movie. Horror films like The Exorcist and Night of the Living Dead, and many others that are equally well-crafted and realistic, invite all of us to confront the demons inside of us. If the cinematic experience cuts deeply enough, we can vicariously learn some important things about ourselves. We can begin to assess how brave we might be, or how cowardly in the face of extreme danger. We can weigh the chances for survival of ourselves and our posterity, especially if those chances depend on ourselves as individuals. We must strive to understand evil so we can stoutly confront it. That is what Russ Streiner was trying to do when he was as emotionally pent up as Reagan and her distraught mother were. The terrors they were facing on screen produced the anxiety he was disturbingly confronting in his imagination. At bottom, that is the very real virtue of horror movies. They force us to weigh and consider our own attributes, or lack thereof, while we're having fun with the thrills and chills they provide. They present sharp insights into the meaning of life and the psychological motives and character traits of real people who we encounter outside of a theater. For millions of years, we human beings were prey for wild animals such as cave bears, crocodiles, and saber-toothed tigers. We harbor an atavistic fear of being devoured that has dwelt inside us for eons. Nowadays, thanks to the current plague of twisted serial killers, we're even more scared of being set upon by strangers who might want to rape or kill us. Cave bears or saber-toothed tigers could be driven away with torches, or vanquished with repeated spear thrusts, if packs of humans warily surrounded them. We human beings had a bare chance against them, no matter how slim. But what about nameless, insidious, invisible spirits with malevolent intentions? Do such spirits actually exist? Many people fervently believe that they do. That is why the evil demon conjured up by the Exorcist still haunts our worst nightmares. In this great new book by Nat Segaloff, The Exorcist Legacy, 50 Years of Fear, enthusiastically explores and explains the movie's everlasting legacy in ways that will greatly entertain its millions of fans. John Russo is the co-writer of the seminal zombie horror film Night of the Living Dead, which celebrates its 55th anniversary in 2023, the same year as the 50th anniversary of the equally pivotal possession film, The Exorcist. Preface: The Secret Screening. The first time I saw The Exorcist, I didn't know I was supposed to throw up. I also didn't dive under my seat, cover my eyes, or run screaming from the theater and head for the first church. It was because I was guarding the door of a secret screening with strict orders to let no one in who hadn't been invited. The Exorcist, easily 1973's most hotly anticipated film, was scheduled to open Wednesday, December 26th, at only 22 theaters nationally, one of which was the Cinema 57, a twin-screen structure that was a prime showplace of Boston's SAC Theaters chain, for whom I was publicity director. The Wednesday date posed a problem for the city's two weekly alternative newspapers, the Boston Phoenix and the Real Paper, whose publishing schedules were such that their reviews would appear a week late. As they served Boston's commercially important youth market, the lapse was crucial. Eager to meet his deadline and especially savvy about the ways of the industry, Stuart Byron, the film editor and chief film critic for the Real Paper, wired the film's director, William Friedkin, asking for an advance screening the day before. Byron, a former studio publicist, had deep knowledge of the industry, coupled with flamboyance as a critic. He assured Friedkin that he had no doubt that the film would be a phenomenon, and stressed that it would benefit from allowing the city's weekly papers to meet their deadlines. In fact, he added, the extra day would allow even the critics for the daily papers to give more thoughtful reviews. Friedkin, who I later learned could be as flamboyant as Byron, consented to the screening, which was quickly and discreetly arranged through the New England publicity agent for Warner Brothers, Carl Fassick, and SAC's executive vice president, A. Alan Friedberg. As the chain's publicist, I was instructed to invite the critics, swear them to secrecy, and break it to them that they could not invite their editors, family, friends, etc. In case you've lost track of the day before December 26th is Christmas. The screening involved unusual logistics. Having been beset with production and post-production delays, the film's cut negative and sound mix had been delivered so late to Metro Color that the lab was working around the clock to get prints out to the first wave of theaters, starting with those in the East and moving west. Had Santa himself carried it to the Cinema 57 on Christmas Eve, it would have been easier than waiting for the shipper to wend their way through the holiday traffic from Logan Airport. Only The Exorcist could have enticed a cadre of jaded film critics to leave their families at 10 a.m. on Christmas morning. Although, come to think of it, that might have been an incentive. Some 20 Boston media scribes staggered into the Cinema 57 on December 25th, with their notebooks open, if not their eyes. They spread out across the 600-seat house. The print had arrived so late that the projectionist had not been able to preview it to set the light or audio levels. Those of us in whose hands the fate of the picture rested were a little tense when the house lights went down and the first eerie musical notes seeped from behind the screen. The tension would not let up for the next 2 hours and 2 minutes. One of the joys of being a critic is seeing a new film before the start of public word of mouth. This was decades before social media invented the word spoiler. In the best cases, a critic is able to bring attention to films that might, for any number of reasons, budget, obscurity, content, otherwise escape wider notice. The exact opposite was the case with The Exorcist. The public was well aware that it was coming. They had either read the bestseller or seen the short teaser trailer whose understated message was spoken by a studiously nonchalant narrator. Because people would inevitably be arriving for the scheduled 12:30 performance of the 57's then-current attraction, I was posted at the auditorium door to keep strangers from wandering in. This meant that I could not be inside watching, but could poke my head in and out when I'd hear something exciting, then go back to my post. Perhaps that's why I did not immediately succumb to the film's power. As for the critics, after the screening they emerged, inscrutable as always, Stewart among them. I can understand their position. They knew the film was going to be a smash regardless of anything they might say about it. Would they hop on the bandwagon, or would they become a voice on the curb citing the Emperor's nudity just to get noticed? Moreover, would it be a factor that this was overwhelmingly Catholic Boston? They filed out in silence. When I became a critic a few years later, I learned that post-screening silence isn't indicative of having been moved. It's to keep colleagues from stealing your wisecracks. The next day, when the film opened, the reviews pronounced it effective. Some compared it with the book, and nearly all made note of the extreme language and the MPAA R rating. Then the bedlam began. In the SAC Theater's executive offices high atop the Savoy Theater on downtown Washington Street, we began getting reports from Merrill Franks, Cinema 57's manager, that people were running up the aisles and into the lobby, some of them making it out to the street before vomiting, while others did it en route. Said Tom Kajacek, the company's most experienced manager who was hurriedly dispatched to the 57 to wrangle the throngs, "I remember them throwing up, and I couldn't imagine people being affected like that. I just stood around and watched the crowd. That was a movie in itself. Part of it was getting caught up in the excitement around the film, not the film itself." He's right. Ticket holders waiting in line for the next performance would see the distressed faces of those leaving and pump themselves into a frenzy even before the lights went down. Inasmuch as the 57 was a twin cinema, and the Sting opened on the same day across the lobby, people who were there to see the Newman Redford film must have been really confused. Soon word came in from Carl Fasek, no doubt informed by studio publicist Joe Hyams, that similar reactions were being observed in the 21 other cities where The Exorcist had opened. This was before cell phones, the internet, or Twitter. How did people know they were supposed to react this way? And how did they all know at the same time? The phenomenon had started. Even Stuart Byron wrote in his review that the film had made him sick. Such viewer reaction, half a century later, has yet to abate. To this day, there are people who refuse to see The Exorcist. Despite this aversion, somebody must be seeing it. Since 1973, there have been a sequel, an official sequel, and a prequel, each of which exists in 2 versions, a TV series, a trilogy of continuations, and countless cultural references, all of them hearkening back to the 1973 original. That's what this book is about. I finally managed to see The Exorcist straight through the following weekend. This time I stood in the back because the house was sold out. I got in for free, as it would be for weeks to come. By then, it was an intellectual experience, not an emotional one. I had prepared by reading William Peter Blatty's book and wondered how he and director William Friedkin could possibly squeeze all of it into one movie. They didn't, and I later learned that the omissions had, for a time, tarnished their friendship. I tried to understand why people of faith seemed disturbed in ways that other people were not. I also saw that the artistry and thought that went into the film were genuine. Regardless of what many people continue to believe, Blatty and Friedkin did not set out to make a horror movie. Sure, The Exorcist is viscerally scary, but its power comes from its ability to touch, challenge, and, yes, exploit the spiritual beliefs of its viewers. It is both a film about the mystery of faith, their term, and an examination of their own religious quests. That's also what this book is about. When The Exorcist came out, it was just a movie. Over the next 50 years, it became a legend. That's what this is about, too. The Exorcist stands, half a century after it was birthed in fire and brimstone, as a unique product of a Hollywood system that no longer exists. As William Friedkin said on many occasions, "I didn't set out to scare the hell out of people, as you do with a horror film. I set out to make a film that would make them think about the concept of good and evil." That remains a worthy achievement, and it's time the world acknowledged that he and his cohorts more than succeeded. Nat Segaloff, Los Angeles, 2023. Note: as a study of a remarkable and influential film and its progeny, this book necessarily contains a great number of spoilers. Chapter 1. The Two Bills. The Exorcist may be the most misunderstood classic of all time. It heads the list of the world's scariest horror movies, yet its creators staunchly regard it as a whodunit with spiritual overtones. It's been called the scariest film ever made, but it has only one traditional screen shock, a candle flaring up, and nobody jumping out of the shadows. Scholars have said it reflects the social and political upheavals of its era, yet it draws its power from religious attitudes so old that they survived the Enlightenment. It contains images that have been called subliminal, yet the man who directed it says he had nothing in mind beyond trying to tell a good story. There is ongoing dispute about the ending. Even its victim is misplaced. Many people think it's about a 12-year-old girl, yet the secretary who retyped William Peter Blatty's manuscript before anybody else had read it correctly asked the author, "They're after him, aren't they?" meaning Damien Karras, the priest. Like all great art, people take from it what they bring to it, and people brought a lot to The Exorcist. On its surface, it's about the demonic possession of a 12-year-old girl. Beneath its surface, however, it's about something more personal, more familiar, more threatening, and therein resides its power. Beyond the shaking beds, crucifix mutilations, streaming pea soup, and spinning heads, what makes The Exorcist so affecting is that its emotional core is a mother's desire to protect her child and, on a more metaphysical level, whether we, as humans, are worthy of walking on God's earth. That's a very good description, agrees Ellen Burstyn, who played the mother, Chris MacNeil, adding, "I see it in terms of the confrontation with the unknown. Certainly the aspect of the mother protecting her daughter is the thread of the story. As a genre, I see it as a psychological drama. I never have thought of it as a horror film. As a matter of fact, I'm sure you know this, it's the only film that's called a horror film that's been nominated for Best Picture. But Stephen King, no slouch in the horror genre, believes that the mother-daughter story is secondary to the real subtext of The Exorcist, namely the generation gap. The movie and the novel is nominally about the attempts of two priests to cast a demon out of young Regan MacNeil, a pretty little sub-teen played by Linda Blair, he writes in Danse Macabre. Substantively, however, it is a film about explosive social change, a finely honed focusing point for that entire youth explosion that took place in the late 60s and early 70s. It was a movie for all those parents who felt, in a kind of agony and terror, that they were losing their children and could not understand why or how it was happening. It's the face of the werewolf again, a Jekyll and Hyde tale in which sweet, lovely, and loving Regan turns into a foul-talking monster strapped into her bed and croaking, in the voice of Mercedes McCambridge, such charming homilies as, "You're going to let Jesus fuck you, fuck you, fuck you." Religious trappings aside, every adult in America understood what the film's powerful subtext was saying. They understood that the demon in Regan MacNeil would have responded enthusiastically to the fish cheer in Woodstock. Horror scholar/historian David J. Skal builds on that observation. The film became a highly publicized cultural ritual, exorcising not the devil, but rather the confused parental feelings of guilt and responsibility in the Vietnam era when, at least from a certain conservative perspective, filthy-mouthed children were taking personality-transforming drugs, violently acting out, and generally making life unpleasant for their elders. King and Skal might be surprised to learn that their metaphor about youth rebellion is more accurate than they could have imagined, as the actual case is explored in the next chapter. Critical sophistry aside, it's doubtful that audiences who bought tickets did so to take part in a cultural revolution. They may have come for the thrills, but they were held rapt by identifying with Chris MacNeil's tireless pursuit of help for her daughter. As such, The Exorcist provides one of the best starring roles for an actress, Ellen Burstyn, among a wealth of female-centric films of the 1970s. This would turn out to be a factor in how audiences responded. By gender. Of the viewers who fled auditoriums during the film's initial run, it was mostly men. The women stayed. In hindsight, the reason seems basic. If a woman can endure the pain of childbirth and care for a sick child even if she herself is ill, surely she could remain in the theater seat in support of Regan MacNeil. The motherhood theme is even more intimately intertwined with The Exorcist because the two men most responsible for its existence, writer William Peter Blatty and director William Friedkin, were especially close to their mothers. As the only child of Rachel Green and Louis Friedkin, she from Kiev, he from Chicago, according to their son's August 29, 1935 birth certificate, William David Friedkin always spoke of a happy home life, yet spent much of it on the streets of the Windy City. Ray, as everyone called her with love and respect, came from a family where she had 12 siblings, Louis from one where he had 11, and yet his and Ray's union resulted in an only child. Consequently, young Billy was the apple of his mother's eye being the appropriate word since she had lost one of hers in her younger years and had it replaced with a glass implant. An operating room nurse who gave up her career to raise her son, she was the anchor of the family trio as Louis, an itinerant worker, was always in and out of employment. "My father never earned more than $50 a week in his life," Friedkin says, a judgment that would surface as a series of unsympathetic portrayals of father figures in The Exorcist and his other films. When the Friedkins were reduced to welfare, Ray resumed her profession in the various hospitals near the family's 4826 North Sheridan Avenue address. As soon as Billy was old enough to work, he hawked sodas at nearby Wrigley Field, ran errands for neighborhood residents, sold duds at a cut-rate clothing store owned by his uncle, Sid Green, and bar-backed at a tavern run by another uncle, Harry Lang, who had married Ray's sister, Sarah. More at home on the streets than in a classroom, he barely graduated from Senn High School in January 1953, half a semester behind his peers. It was Harry Lang who triggered Friedkin's lifelong fascination with crime. Lang had been a Chicago cop during the reign of Al Capone, and as Friedkin told it, he and his patrol partner Harry Miller were on the take from Frank Nitti, Capone's enforcer and eventual successor. Imagine their embarrassment when, one day, they were ordered by an anti-corruption police commissioner to bring Nitti in. They went into Nitti's office, Friedkin says, where they used to go all the time, and this is how Nitti got caught, as opposed to all the fiction about it. Nitti had no weapon, but they did. My uncle shot Nitti 8 times, and Nitti lived. My uncle then shot himself in his left hand and claimed that Nitti had drawn on him first. Nitti survived, but Uncle Harry's career did not. He retired from the force and opened a pub that catered to both cops and cons. And, of course, Billy, as barback, became a captivated habitué. When he was 20, but still looking young, as he always would, he encountered his third fascination, the first being crime and the second being women. Media, in this case, television. Answering a newspaper ad for a mailboy at Chicago's WGN-TV, Friedkin began sorting packages in the mailroom, using his daily delivery rounds to familiarize himself with all aspects of television production. It was at this time that his father began deteriorating and had to be taken to the Cook County Hospital, where he died within 2 weeks, probably, his son later offered, of cancer. Billy and his mother were devastated, both emotionally and financially. His intelligence and acumen led him from the mailroom to become a gopher, a floor manager, and then a director at a succession of Chicago TV stations. Most of it involved routine chat shows and live studio-bound news broadcasts, and he began looking for opportunities to get out of the studio. A bright autodidact, he became a social animal, using his skill reading people's personalities to make his way in a hostile world. He was always looking for some way to better himself, says Ken Nordine, an announcer who devised the concept of word jazz and whose stentorian Orson Wellesian voice made him a radio guru to a generation of listeners. He was eager, driving, and opportunistic. His strength outside of his energy was his ability to size up situations and people that he could get the most out of and to learn to use in some way. His breakthrough came while he worked at WTTW-TV and was befriended by Chicago Tribune columnist Fran Coughlin, whom Friedkin considers his mentor. Coughlin introduced Billy the Kid to such Chicago literati as editor/publisher Lois Solomon of the paper, Times' Miriam Romwell Selby, broadcaster Studs Terkel, columnist/author Nelson Algren, lawyers Donald Page Moore and Elmer Gertz, journalists John Justin Smith and Irv Kupsonet, and occasional visitor Lenny Bruce. He changed jobs as opportunities presented themselves. Going back to work in 1960 at WGN-TV with an open mandate to do specials, Friedkin scouted the city for a subject worthy of his interest. At one of the Solomon soirees, he heard of a man named Paul Crump, who was sitting on death row in the Cook County Jail, but was probably innocent. Friedkin asked his WGN bosses to let him make a documentary about it. When they declined, Friedkin approached Sterling Red Quinlan at competing station WBKB-TV, and a deal was struck. The two men reached an understanding that, along with WBKB's $7,000 budget, the film was going to be a defense of Crump. Quinlan said he had no problem with that as long as the result was labeled as such. At WBKB, Friedkin teamed with one of the station's studio cameramen, Wilmer Butler, who would later use the name Bill Butler to photograph, among other films, Jaws, and began experimenting with the new lightweight 16mm film equipment. The two young men taught themselves the techniques of production as they went along. The result was 1962's The People vs. Paul Crump. Paul Crump, 31, sat on Illinois' death row, convicted of murder in a 1953 robbery of the Libby, McNeil, and Libby meatpacking plant during which Theodore Zukowski, a security guard, was killed. Although Crump didn't pull the trigger, he was convicted.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?